Hello everyone, my name is Kelsey and welcome back to my channel. We're gonna avoid the whole shindig that, I'm sad, my life is whatever right now, and we're just gonna get into talking about the books that I read in the month of April. So for the month of April, I read 7 books, which is not my best month, and as you can tell by the lack of inspiration and videos, it wasn't a good month overall. I read 5 male authors, 2 female authors, and 1 two-spirit individual. The 5 male authors might connotate to such a negative reading month. It's split up into 6 adult and 1 YA, so not really balanced, which might also have affected the way I've rated my books. I read 3,197 pages, which is not my best. It averages to about 106 pages a day, which is still good, but you know. I read 1 DNF, 1 2-star book, 4 3-star books, 2 4-star books, and 1 5-star book, and let's just get into this. So first I'm going to start with 2 books that I didn't finish in the month of April, which was The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller and Days of Blood and Starlight by Laini Taylor. One I really enjoyed, one I didn't really enjoy, that started my reading slump and I'm not happy about it. Anyways, you'll hear about these in my May wrap-up since I did finish them at the beginning of this month. But my true DNF for the month of April is The Godfather by Mario Puzo. I just knew I wasn't going to give this anything higher than like a 3 stars. Even though this is the classic, I think it's a shame that I've seen this story so much that I personally didn't feel like it was bringing anything new, and I kind of like read spoilers and I just see where it's going. I DNF'd it at page 162. I just wasn't into it. I guess in this case, I made such a big stink that I wanted to read this before I watched the movie, but I don't give a shit. I will watch the movie. Sometimes, you know, you just have to suck up your ego. I digress. I take it back. I'm just gonna watch this movie. The 1 2-star book I read for the month of April was 10:04 by Ben Lerner. This is a story that follows it's a self-insert, auto-fictionalized novel where the main character's name is Ben, and he is also a writer, much like the author himself. He lives in New York, but it also blends the line between what is reality and what is fiction within the author's life. I read this for class because we were talking about the auto-fictionalized narrative. I don't see it as any different from a normal fiction book. If Ben Lerner would have changed the name of the character to, let's say, Dan, and Dan was also a writer who happened to live in New York City, that wouldn't have changed anything for me because I didn't know anything about Ben Lerner as an author, as a person. So to me, Ben was his own character in the book, and the fictional points of the novel where, let's say, a big hurricane occurs that wouldn't have occurred in New York at the time, or stuff like that, time travel. It was a very weird collection of things that blended this aspect of reality and fiction, but that didn't change the way I understood the novel, because I didn't see the character as similar to Ben Lerner because I don't know Ben Lerner personally. So I just didn't understand the reasoning behind this grandiose discussion behind auto-fictionalized narrative, but that's the pedagogy of my school and I don't want to talk about it because I graduated. But I think he has a really interesting writing style, and I do think he is far more talented than I think I can ever expect myself to be. I think he's very good with words, but this book is just hella confusing. I was so lost every couple of paragraphs. I felt myself rereading situations just because I really wanted to truly understand the novel, and I just couldn't. And so we're moving scene to scene in the novel, and it's like you don't really know what's fiction and what's reality, which is the purpose, but it just made the plot seem far more confusing than I feel like it needed to be. There are also some points in the novel where I fell asleep reading, so I just think this wasn't the book for me. Maybe it's the book for you. Let me know if you've read it and if it just surpassed a level of understanding that I will never comprehend. Now we're moving into my 3-star books. So the first 3-star book I read was The Refrigerator Monologues by Catherine M. Valente. This is a collection of short stories that followed wives of superheroes, and the concept of being refrigerated was coined by Catherine M. Valente, and it's kind of a discussion how the female girlfriend, love interest, whatever, is always shoved into the back burner or raped or murdered, or something happens to that female character that suddenly gives the male superhero a purpose. So an easy example of this would be Gwen Stacy, Spider-Man. She's actually one of the characters in the novel is based off of her. So I thought that that was really interesting, and that was probably like the funnest part of the book. So I give this 3.5 stars overall because I really enjoyed the concept of this novel by reimagining these stories of classic women that have been fridged. She is demonstrating how often this trope is used, and I think that that is the main strength of the novel, is her use of parody within this fictionalization of characters. I think my main issue with the book overall, and unfortunately an issue that I have with a lot of like discussions surrounding these kinds of topics of tropes, is that each story becomes kind of repetitive because you are looking at the same perspective several times. And so it kind of points out how often this trope is used and how we kind of just are blindly following along about these characters who will always be muses. But it also did end up making me feel like the novel was fairly repetitive. And I definitely recommend it if you're very into comics or into like looking at tropes and understanding where tropes come from and kind of twisting them on its head. I thought it was a really interesting take on a novel, and I commend Catherine Valente for doing what she did. The next 3-star book I read in the month of April was The Elfstones of Shannara by Terry Brooks. This follows the story of Will Omsfred and him and the Princess of the Elves, Amberly. They need to travel to this area to get the blood seed in order to bring it back to the Elcrees and have the forbidding spell that keeps the demons at bay working again, because now that the forbidding is weakened, the demons are able to come into the world. I have a lot of issues with this novel because I hate saying this, but I feel like I've said it twice this video, but I would just honestly watch the TV show. I think what's interesting is that the TV show did a better job at justifying characters' motives, and it did such a better job with female characters. I know. When do we say that? Just extreme justice to these characters that I love. And when reading this book, I was really disappointed by how they were presented. Like, Amberly is a badass queen in the show, and I think she was very weak in this. And I think in this she was extremely weak and kind of fell as like Will's love interest. Eritrea is still my favorite character in this book, like she's in the show. I think in here she has her very strong moments that I love. I tabbed every moment that she was there because I think she is a strong character. But much like with Amberly, she is just the strong woman, and Amberly is kind of like the princess trope, and they just become these one-note characters that are only their personality and not really anything else. I think the show also does a better job at explaining the world, which is not the fault of the book because this is a part of like a 20-book series where the world develops. The TV show is able to show you what this world is through the backgrounds and through these little signs here and there, and you begin to understand that this novel works as post-apocalyptic and it's not just a fantasy world. But I think because each book can work as a standalone, the world should be semi-developed. There should be some nods in every book that explain the world to the reader who's just going for it in one shot. I also think, much like with the first book, my main problem with these books is Brooks' writing. It is just not for me. There's no whimsy or like charm to his writing that I appreciate in other fantasy novels, and the bland writing kind of ruined the story for me. I literally finished this book, read this book until the end because I was just so excited to be back in this world because I love the TV show so much. So if you've seen the Shannara Chronicles on TV, please talk to me about it. I love it so much. I will talk to you all day about it. This book, however, 3 stars. I'm being generous because I love the show. My next 3-star book is My Plain Jane by Cynthia Han, Brodie Ashton, and Jodie Meadows. This is a reimagining of Jane Eyre with ghosts. As with their first novel, My Lady Jane, I love the writing in these books so much. These 3 authors are able to create such a seamless narrative that you don't really know who's writing which character, who's writing what portion of the novel. It's done so perfectly that there's no awkwardness in between chapters. My favorite part of these books is definitely the free indirect discourse that they utilize. A lot of it is like placed into the novel where we're supposed to understand how they thought at the time, but they'll throw in like pop culture references of this time to help us understand character motives. It makes the story that much funnier and that much more engaging to the reader. That being said though, I don't think that this was their stronger novel of the 2 that they have out. I was kind of just waiting for it to finish. Maybe that it is because I'm so familiar with the story of Jane Eyre that I found it a tad boring and I was kind of just waiting for it to move forward. And I think that is the case with a lot of retellings. If you're like extremely familiar, sometimes it could be really engaging because you love it so much and you love that story and you want to be in that world again. And sometimes in the case for me where I felt about Jane Eyre, I felt about this just because I don't like the characters as much. I still think it is an extremely charming and funny book, so if you do enjoy the classic, you'll probably enjoy this way more than I did. And my last 3-star book for the month is Death Note Volume 4 by Tsugumi Oba. I don't really want to get into the plot of this because it is the 4th installment, but if you don't know what Death Note is, it is a manga that revolves around a boy named Light, and he finds a Shinkansen's Death Notebook, where in the book, when you write someone's name and the way that they died, the person will die exactly the way that you have intended, or exactly the way that Light has intended. And this is kind of 4 volumes in, so a lot has happened, and the story took such a turn in this book that I was kind of like really engaged until that point. And I think because I was so engaged until that point, I don't really care about what's happening now. I do have 1 more volume left and then it'll be wrapped up, so it's not discouraging me from reading that last book. I don't think there's a problem there to finish it, but it's definitely introduced 2 characters that I really couldn't give a shit about. But I at the same time, I was so tired of this specific character that dies at the beginning of this book, if you know, you know, that I was relieved when he died. And then they just introduced these 2 new characters and I was like, oh my god, like it should have ended there. Maybe I'll change my mind once I read the last volume, but from what people have told me based on my review for this book on like my Instagram and my Goodreads, a lot of people said that like the 5th volume is just kind of downhill. So while I enjoyed this, I'm not really looking forward to the last volume, but I kind of want to read it to get it done at this point. My first 4-star read of the month was Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. This is a story about a boy named Johnny who is a Two-Spirit Native American LGBTQ youth that used to live on reservations and now moved to the big city during the course of this novel. He wants to make a different life for himself, starts off as this cyber sex worker and realizes things about himself, and it becomes kind of this coming of age story. I really enjoyed Johnny as a main character, and I really enjoyed the discussion on how when Native Americans leave their reservations, how rough life can be for them. It was very raw and very true to the Native Canadian experience. Johnny's relationship with one of the main characters in the book was very real, and it made me feel bad for him. It made me feel bad that Johnny felt like he could never, or the limitations for Johnny and Thias never led them to being with their true loves. I like how Whitehead was able to include a lot of pop culture references, and sometimes I feel like they're way too overdone and it really throws me out of the story, but I think Whitehead did a great job at incorporating pop culture references in an interesting and dynamic way that kept me completely engaged and kept me relating to Johnny as a main character. Johnny's story contains moments of sex and violence and addiction. I think it worked to further emphasize how strong they are as a main character and how really real it is to many Canadians. My one complaint for the novel is that it read more as a collection of Johnny's thoughts rather than a cohesive narrative, so sometimes that took me out of the story because I kind of had to figure out where we were within the narrative. But otherwise I think it is a fantastic book and I highly recommend it. Another 4-star book that I read for the month of April is Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. This is a non-fiction novel that discusses why we eat animals and how the world would be affected if we would stop eating animals for personal consumption, for enjoyment rather than nutritional value. I think Foer did an excellent job at painting the meat industry in our current political climate. I think what he wrote about was really raw and disgusting to read at times, but important in understanding why we still as a society deem meat so valuable to our nutrition. I am aware of most practices of slaughterhouses and farms and stuff like that, but I was shocked at how humanity's hive thinking really comes from the government and people at the top, and how this kind of trickles down, and what we're led to believe isn't actually true and was never true. And it was fascinating to me to understand that. Like, I was under the impression that these things that we believe must have come from somewhere, but in the end you learn how advertising has played such an important role in our food industry. I appreciated what Foye did in trying to show how the farming and meat industry is valuable to some Western people, and showing kind of like the pros, I guess, that it could provide, but in reality the cons are so much more greater that they outweigh it, and convinced me into changing the way that we need to eat as a general westernized society. Everybody should read this book. I think it's extremely insightful and extremely valuable. It shows a lot about why we think the way we think. I thought that was really fascinating. And finally, my 1 5-star book for the month of April was A Clash of Kings by George R.R. Martin. This is the second book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. These are the events that occur after what happens in Game of Thrones, which I won't talk about because I mean, people get really antsy about being spoiled for Game of Thrones. The show's been on for 8 years, but if you don't want me to spoil it for you, I won't. But I was really worried going into this reread because I didn't remember a lot of what happened in this book, and I was so nervous that I wasn't going to enjoy it, or I was going to be extremely bored by the plot in this one. But this book completely blew me away for how much foreshadowing is in it. It is incredible to me, and I will say this every time I review a George R.R. Martin book, how great he is at foreshadowing things, like sentences thrown here and there. When you do a reread, you realize how many things he's set up. A lot of things flew over my head when I first read this in 2012, and I noticed now, and I was just highlighting all kinds of pages because I was just in absolute awe at how much I had missed. I don't think I can ever not love this series, and I can't wait for George to finish the series. I think he deserves a break. I think he's an extremely talented writer, and I think it takes a lot to write the things that he writes and build the world that he builds, and I will continue to respect him and I will never shit on him, and I wait patiently for the end of this series. So that's it for my wrap up. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've read any of these books, especially if you've watched the Shannara Chronicles. I really want to talk about it with someone. Do not talk to me about how season 8 of Game of Thrones sucks. I really do not care. Argue with me in the comments, like and dislike, debate. I don't really care. And I guess I will see you next time. I don't know how to end this. Okay, bye.